Yeah, so again, it's an interesting question. Unfortunately, there have been terrorism, and can there be any hatzlacha against these enemies before Moshiach comes? Once Moshiach comes, that's going to be redemption. What about until that point? We will not be able to totally defeat. Basically, all of this evil in the world is connected to Amalek. And it says as long as Amalek is functioning in the world, God's own presence is not complete. God's own name is not complete. God's throne is not complete. So that does mean that by definition, until we reach the level where God reveals the totality of himself through the messianic process, there will be hatred, there will be enemies, there will be deaths. But still, Hashem in his rachamim, sometimes it's in a very, very extreme and sometimes it's very little. So we can certainly legitimately improve the situation, we can legitimately reduce it, but you will never get it down to zero, because that's the nature of an imperfect world where Hashem's presence is not totally revealed. But again, that shouldn't stop us from what's called hishtadlus, efforts to cut it down. And that primarily would be spiritual, by mitzvos, by tzedakah, and also physical, by military and political ways. Yeah.
Sometimes when I put on tefillin out of a state of gratitude and love to Hashem, then I feel that I'm doing the mitzvah because I want to give back to him. Other times I do it out of rut, which is fear out of missing out on the reward or fear of the punishment. I want to know if it's possible to identify what's the root motivation for me pursuing a mitzvah, for example, like tefillin, or does the motivation depend on my state of emotion?
Well, I would say your motivation depends on what is your motivation at that given time, meaning to say there are going to be times in life where we feel gratitude to God, we feel love to Hashem, we feel we want to do for Hashem, and then we're doing the mitzvah at the highest level of love. There are other times where we do it out of habit. Now, the important thing to know is a mitzvah is a mitzvah even if your motives are not the highest. But if your motives are higher, the mitzvah becomes like steroids. It gets ever and ever more powerful. The Zohar has a beautiful expression. The Zohar says, love and fear of God are the wings that lift your mitzvahs up to heaven. So your mitzvahs are mitzvahs no matter what, but the love and the fear, the reverence that you bring, propel them higher and higher. So our mitzvahs go up to different levels. There are mitzvahs that only go so far, mitzvahs that go further. So when you do something out of love, that's an extra push into your mitzvah.
So then shouldn't I try to put myself into a state of love and gratitude before putting on tefillin?
Well, by all means. Remember the Mishnah in Brachos. The Mishnah in Brachos says that the early Hasidim, not the Baal Shem Tov Hasidim, the early Hasidim, the pious people, they used to prepare 1 hour before they davened. So they would prepare for an hour, they would daven for an hour, and then they would decompress for an hour. They did this 3 times a day. 9 hours a day of preparation for it. I'm not sure why Mincha took the same amount of time as Shachris, but apparently it did. Now, and the Gemara in fact asks, you're davening 9 hours a day, when are you going to learn? And they answered that because their prayer was so pure, Hashem blessed their Torah learning time, that they achieved much more than a normal person could achieve in much less time. But why do you need an hour before you daven? Now again, most of us don't have that hour, but the theory behind it is that that's how you meditate. You put yourself in a frame of mind where you feel appreciation and you feel reverence and you feel awe. And then by the time when you start davening, you're davening from a place where you have certain feelings. When we have to rush to shul, and I include myself, we rush to shul and, we start davening, even if we're on time, we're just on time, and then we're late, which is even worse. Even if we manage to say everything, and sometimes we don't manage to say everything, we didn't prepare ourselves. If you didn't prepare ourselves, it's not going to be the same emotional, spiritual, religious experience. So I'm not suggesting that you put yourself in this mood if you're going to miss Minyan or miss Mount Kriya Shema. But assuming that you can get here a little early, it's very worthwhile to try to put yourself in that mood. Yeah.
Well, could you talk about Tzimzum and how that kind of applies to the world and also like the difference between like the people who believe in Tzimzum, the people who don't believe in Tzimzum? How does that?
Okay, so here we have a Kabbalist. The word Tzimzum is just a word that means contraction or shrinking or withdrawal. The term is used in the Gemara in a variety of different contexts, but the particular meaning of Tzimzum that you're asking about in your question is a concept developed by the Arizal, the Ari, the great Kabbalist, where the Ari starts off with a very fundamental question. If God is everywhere, God occupies every inch of space, then how can physical things exist? How can I exist? How can the table exist? How can anything exist? God is supposed to be occupying this space. So the Arizal said, the very first thing Hashem had to do when he decided to create the world is withdraw into himself, kind of shrink into himself, creating a halal. Halal means an empty space. And in that empty space, the light of God shines, and then you form physical reality. So Tzimzum quite literally means the contraction of the infinity of God, which is called the Ein Sof, in order to make a halal, to make an empty space for physical reality. Now, there is a huge machlokes among the Mekubalim, and normally it's described as a machlokes between the Baal HaTanya and the Vilna Gaon, although it's not so clear, but that's how it's normally understood. Whether Tzimtzum is understood literally, which means Tzimtzum kipshuto, that literally God vacated the space, that there was a space that God vacated to allow physical reality. So the Vilna Gaon is normally associated with the view that Tzimtzum is understood very literally, that literally God emptied himself from the space. The Baal HaTanya maintains that that's apikorsis. How can you say there's any place in the universe that God vacated? And therefore he says it doesn't mean Tzimtzum actually happens, but God created an appearance of vacating, which allows reality, but it's not a true reality. That's a machlokas. Now, each one argued that the other position was apikorsis. The Baal HaTanya said the Gra's position is apikorsis because you're saying God is not in this place. The Gra says the Baal HaTanya's sheet is apikorsis because you're saying everything is God. You're saying, I'm God, this is God, the table's God. How could that be? There has to be a notion that God withdrew, so to speak. Otherwise you have pantheism. Everything is God. How could that be? So, it's a kind of an arcane controversy, but I just want to point out that Tzimtzum also has a very, very important psychological, spiritual idea. And that is what enables my autonomy. You know, one of the big questions in Jewish philosophy is how do you reconcile free will with divine omnipotence? You know, God is all powerful. God controls everything. So how can you say that I have the power to rebel against God? How can I rebel against God? That means I'm stronger than God in that sense. How does one understand God being omnipotent with the human being's freedom to rebel against God? And the answer is, that is what Tzimtzum actually explains, that in order to facilitate human autonomy, human freedom, God withdrew his omnipotence so that I'm able to make my decisions. That's quite an amazing idea spiritually. In other words, God tied his own, I'm using a physical metaphor, God tied his hands so that I will have freedom of choice. So Tzimtzum is actually the underlying Kabbalistic explanation for the phenomenon of free will. Free will exists because of Tzimtzum. God withdrew so I could function autonomously and the like. So it's quite a remarkable idea because God controls, you know, the sun and the moon and the planets and the rotation of the earth, but God does not control my decisions to serve him or not to serve him. He left that to me, which is quite an amazing extraordinary idea. Yeah.
Rabbi, how does one go on the challenge of ego within his davening?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One of the reasons why davening is so hard for us, and many people, okay, learning is hard also, but many people find learning much easier than davening. And part of that is because in learning, we are able to bring a great deal of our ego to the learning. Because learning is about intellectual debate, intellectual challenge. You say something and I can show you why you're wrong. I say something, you can show me why I'm wrong. So we can enjoy learning, even with the spiritual aspects of it, because there's a lot of ego that we bring to it. Davening is exactly the opposite. Davening, we humble ourselves before God. We recognize without God, we're nothing. I need Hashem for every single step. That's very hard for us to do. It's very hard to put aside our ego. Because we want to, number one, we want to have a sense of control over our lives. Otherwise, you get very desperate. And we want to feel good about our ability to accomplish. And Hashem doesn't want you to be depressed, and Hashem wants you to feel good also. But we got to put aside our ego. And that's part of the challenge, that to recognize that if I'm successful in life, it's because Hashem gave me that bracha. If I'm healthy, it's because Hashem gave me my health, right? Nothing is mine. Nothing is something that I directly accomplished. Hopefully I make the right choices, and that's my responsibility. But the outcomes of your choices are God, not yours. You see? So it's a very, very difficult process, how to kind of put aside our ego. But that's a very, very important idea. You know, Rabbi Kiveger once remarked about what is the definition of a humble person. So he said, a humble person is not a person who thinks he's great, because that's the opposite of being humble, but it's also not a person who thinks he's worthless. That's not humility. Humility is you don't think about yourself that much at all. I don't think I'm great. Because if you think about it, there's a common denominator between a Baal Gaiva and a person of low self-esteem. And that is, everything is a referendum on them. So the Baal Gaiva, everything that happens, he says, oh, that proves how great I am. And the guy with low self-esteem, everything that happens, that proves what a loser I am. The truly humble person doesn't look at things in terms of me. They look at things in terms of what needs to be done. They are what you call task-oriented rather than personality-oriented. And that's why a humble person can get a lot of satisfaction when they do a mitzvah, but they also get satisfaction when somebody else does a mitzvah. They're happy that something good was done. You know, I remember when my son was in second grade, so they had like a Shabbos Abba, you know, Friday they have, you know, a Shabbos was a co-ed school, so they have Shabbos Abba, Shabbos Ima, whatever it would be. And they also give an award for the best student of the week. So I remember one day my son came home, second grade, and he was so excited because his best friend Meir got the award for best Abba, or best student. So I didn't say it, Baruch Hashem I didn't say it. I was thinking, what are you so happy about? You didn't get the award. Why are you so happy that Meir got the award? But then I realized what a sweet thing it was that he was just as happy for his friend as he would be for himself. It's great that I got it. It's great that he got it. And that's a great thing because it's far too often, you know, we get into our ego, we get into our jealousy, even among our friends. The Somayach remarks, Meir Simcha, the namesake of our yeshiva, remarks that, you know, there's a mitzvah to have empathy for somebody who's suffering, and there's also a mitzvah to rejoice in their successes. Right? Both of them are true. He said, though, it's easier to have empathy when somebody is down than to rejoice when they're successful. Meaning, when somebody is down, I feel sorry for them. I do feel sorry for them. But when somebody is successful, you know, there's going to be some jealousy there. My good friend, now why did my good friend get the promotion I didn't, etc. You know, even in something like dieting, there's a whole literature how if a group of people decide to diet, let's say usually it's women, right? And most of them fail, and one of them is very successful, there'll be all sorts of subtle ways in which the friends will try to get the person off the diet. They say, Oh, you look so emaciated. Have a piece of cake. What's the big deal? Etc. Because there's a certain dynamic that we don't like to see people succeed if we're not succeeding. And that comes from ego. And Rabbeinu Yonah actually writes about it in Shari Tshuva. He talks about the idea that there's a certain category of a person who might even seem to be a tzaddik, but they don't like when other people do mitzvahs. And he calls that by a very, very, very strong name. He says, those are called haters of God. Haters of Hashem. Sonei Hashem. Because if you are only happy when you're doing the mitzvah, and you don't get happy when someone else is doing the mitzvah, then you're not thinking of Hashem at all. You're thinking about my ego. I want to be the big guy. I want to be the tzaddik. That's just egotism. That's not avodas Hashem. Avodas Hashem is you're happy when mitzvahs are being done. I'm happy when I do them, and I'm happy when you're doing them. And that comes from modesty. Humility means I don't make everything about me. If I could quote Ronald Reagan, again, not a Jewish source, but Ronald Reagan said, there's no end to what could be accomplished if you don't care who gets the credit. And that's a very nice statement, meaning it's not about credit, it's about getting things done. And you're happy when you do it, and you're happy when other people do it. In fact, the Chazon Ish gave an interesting mashal about achnosas orchim. Some people argue with the mashal. Well, I'll tell you the mashal that he gave. He said, let's imagine that you're a person who loves to invite guests for Shabbos. So every Friday night after shul, you look around for someone who seems to be a newcomer, and you invite them. And you love having guests. Achnosas orchim is a big, big, big deal for you. So let's assume one Friday night, the shul is kind of empty. There aren't that many new faces. You finally see a new face. And you go to that person with great joy, and you say, oh, Rabbi Yid, I'd love to have you as a guest at my Shabbos table. And the person says, oh, thank you so much, but just 2 minutes before, so-and-so invited me. Stop the cameras. What is your feeling at that moment? Are you happy or are you sad? So the Chazon Ish claimed this is kind of a litmus test about why you do mitzvahs. Because if the pshat is you're genuinely concerned about a person who needs a place, and you're sad that they don't have a place, then the fact that they have a good place, it's not you, but so what? Baruch Hashem, you're taken care of. But if the chesed is about ego, I want to be the great host, then you're going to be upset. Now, let me emphasize right off the bat, it's much, 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 much better to do chesed than not to do chesed. So even if part of the motivation is egotism, okay, do it anyway. Now, the Chazon Ish is not saying don't invite people if you get some ego satisfaction out of it. But just in terms of highest levels, you understand that the Baal Chesed, it doesn't have to be that he's the one that does it. The Baal Chesed rejoices when Chesed is being done. And that's the idea of putting your ego aside. And it's a great, it's a difficult accomplishment in life. And you also got to be careful how to say this. Don't put your ego aside prematurely, because sometimes we need the motivations of ego to get us to the right place. Meaning, as you graduate to tzaddik or gadol, your next project might be, I will try to get rid of my ego. But sometimes when we're younger, we need a certain amount of ego, because that kind of pushes us to achievement. Because many of us are not motivated enough unless we feel a certain glorification that we're getting. Yeah.
So this is when it comes to Shomer Negia.
Yeah.
Can you be a bit maker when it comes to, for example, I have a non-Jewish side of my family, and I have cousins and aunts that will probably hug me every time they see me, and it will create enormous problems if I don't. With my parents, they will not be the best makar of my other family for the Yiddishkeit.
Yeah. These are obviously anyone that's about tshuva, whether their relatives are Jewish or not Jewish, is going to face very, very difficult issues of what are called shomer negia. Obviously, hugging, kissing mother is not a problem. That includes grandmother and all the way up as far as you go. etc. So at least that's not going to be an issue. With sister, that's interesting. Sister is an interesting pilpul that one would have to spend a lot of time on. But there is a halachic basis that if you don't see your sister that often, and it's sporadic, we might allow an adult sister. A sister below bas mitzvah for sure is mutter. That's not a problem, but above bas mitzvah, there is a basis for heterim. And according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, this could also apply to a blood aunt. By a blood aunt, I mean your father's sister or your mother's sister. It would not apply to an aunt through marriage, someone who married your uncle. However, no matter how you slice it, first cousins and beyond, are not within any type of heter, meaning Negia, mother is okay, grandmother is okay, sister I can give you a heter for, blood aunt I can give you a possible heter for even. But once you come to first cousins and beyond, you're really in trouble. There is an issur of Negia. So what do? So there are a few things. One possibility is, well, it depends. Legabe shaking hands, although that's probably, you're talking about more than that. So that gets us into another machlokus, because there are some poskim who take the position that shaking a hand is not a sexual gesture, and therefore it's not nichlal in negia, and particularly when the person put out their hand first, you're allowed to take it not to embarrass them. Now, I want to be honest with you. That heter itself, many poskim in Eretz Yisrael especially, do not accept. But in the United States, there are rabbanim that are somech on it. So in a difficult case like you, I would say you could at least rely on the shaking of hands and be somech on the people who matter that, even for non-related women. But what about more than that? What about the hug? What about the kiss? At that point, is a high five like shaking hands? Okay, high five is somewhere in between. So here we do get into trouble. Some have said that if you simply allow them to hug you and you're kind of stationary, some have said that is mutter. In fact, I'll tell you a story. Some people don't believe this story, and I'm not sure if it's totally true. But I'll tell you, it was reported by a person who was a frum psychiatrist, so I assume that he probably has a cheskes kashrus. This is an amazing story. He's a psychiatrist today, but he writes about something that happened when he was 9 years old. He said he was raised in a frum home, but his aunts and uncles were not religious. And his aunt was not religious, but she was the camp nurse in an Orthodox camp. So she calls him up one day and says, "Hey, Sammy, did you ever hear of Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein?" So he's so excited. "Rabbi Feinstein, Moshe, you're the Gadol Hador." He says, "Well, Sammy, he comes to this camp, every a few weeks to visit the camp. So if you come on Friday, you'll be able to see Rabbi Feinstein." So the kid was so excited. He put on a suit. He's going to a summer camp, but he puts on a suit and a hat. He's going to see Rav Moshe Feinstein. And he gets there like a half an hour early before Rav Moshe was supposed to arrive. And he sees his aunt sitting as the nurse, receptionist also. And she's wearing a sleeveless, thing. He is so embarrassed. "Rav Moshe Feinstein is coming. You're sitting like, in your sleeveless thing." He didn't say anything, but he really felt this is not going to be good. So then Rav Moshe comes and his aunt gets up and says, "Rabbi Feinstein, so good to see you." And then it's like those movies where something's happening in slow motion. He couldn't believe it. She's walking towards him. And he thinks, it can't be what he thinks is going to happen. Is she going to hug him? What is going to happen? And he was like, he's a fourth grader. And he's like paralyzed. And she goes over and she puts her arms around him. Says, "Rabbi Feinstein, so good to see you." So the kid says, the man describes later, he felt he wanted to die. He wanted to go through the earth. He wanted to be swallowed up like Korach. And when he's introduced to Rav Moshe, he just starts talking, "I'm so sorry, my aunt is not religious," whatever he's a kid. He says, "My aunt's not religious, she doesn't know." And Rav Moshe just put his finger on his mouth, didn't he? He told her later, this is what the boy reports, he told the boy later, "Your aunt is a Holocaust survivor. She has numbers on her arm." He says, A Holocaust survivor we don't give musar to. They went through enough. We don't embarrass. So, what's the halachic takeaway from the story? Not really clear. Certainly, Rav Moshe would not have mattered Negiah. But apparently he held that passively, just passively allowing the embrace in cases where that otherwise would cause great pain might be something you don't have to disengage. So you try to minimize as much as you can, but you can let them. Yeah.
Just on that question, is it any different for a girl to like an uncle?
Yes, it is, unfortunately. The heter that Rav Moshe would give us for an aunt and a nephew would not apply to a niece and an uncle. So there, you'd have to have the other heterim that I spoke about. Yeah.
What kavanah should we have during shofar blowing?
Yeah, so that's a very fascinating machloka. Shofar, right? The mitzvah of shofar coming up this year. We don't have a Torah mitzvah of shofar, right? Because under Torah law, it is the first day of Rosh. There's only one day of Rosh Hashanah. The second day of Rosh Hashanah is rabbinic due to the calendar. And since when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, we don't blow shofar. So on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we're not going to blow shofar this year. We're only going to blow on the second day, which is Rabbanan. So this year, amazingly enough, we are not going to be zocheh to the mitzvah d'oraisa of blowing the shofar. But still, your question is still a valid question on either day of Rosh Hashanah. What is our kavanah when we blow shofar? So the interesting thing is that's a machlokas, the Arizal and the Vilna Gaon, once again. The Arizal says the dominant emotion of shofar is trembling in the presence of God that is judging if you will live or die in the coming year. It is the summons to judgment. It's like the judge, you're about to go to court, and you must prepare yourself with mitzvos and masim tovim and thoughts of tshuva, and therefore shofar is a vehicle of trepidation, shaking, fear. That's what the Arizal says. The Vilna Gaon says the opposite. Shofar is the joyous coronation of Hashem as a king. We are blowing the trumpets to proclaim that God is our king, and we have the privilege and honor and joy of serving him. So the answer is, but both emotions are there at the same time. It's very hard to figure out how to balance it. But there's a phrase in Tehillim that encapsulates the paradox. It says, V'gilu bira'ada. Gilu bira'ada means rejoice in trembling. You tremble, you rejoice at the same time. Okay, I hope that makes sense. But this is kind of the emotions of shofar. So you think about all of these things. You think about how your life is in the hands of God, the life of your family, the life of the world, Klal Yisrael, the whole world. And you think about divine mercy at that moment. But you also think about the joy of being a Jew that is a servant of Hashem. And you're proclaiming him as king. Rosh Hashanah is called, it's called Yom Adin, the Day of Judgment. It is also called Yom HaKeseh, which means the day of enthronement, the day of coronation. Rosh Hashanah is the day that we re-coronate God as king. And coronation is a happy event, right? You had a British coronation a few months ago, right? So, well, once again, this is the coronation of Hashem. Hashem Yisbarach on Rosh Hashanah. So that's a very joyous thing. Yeah.
So I recently saw a video of yours talking about the Chabad Rebbe as Moshiach and how it could be seen as heresy. But then the other day I heard someone say like a lot of what Reform Jews and conservative Jews do is also heresy. And coming from like a Reform background, people ask me like, what's like you're being more religious, more observant. Like what's wrong with what we do? Like we're good people. Like how could I say like what you're doing isn't right without sounding harsh, condescending?
Yeah.
I've felt in the past some of that condescending
Sure,
thought,
sure,
and I
sure,
really don't
understand.
want to be someone to pass that on. I want to like show them how great being more religious is without but like I'd love to know like how I could identify things that they do that aren't right, and then.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I want to make very clear is that none of us want to attack Reform or conservative Jews.
Right.
Many of them are very fine people. Many of them are good people. Many of them, have good midos, good character, and they give good values to their children in that way. And if they don't keep the commandments, a lot of it is because they weren't raised that way.
Yeah.
They never had the background. So nothing is about finding fault with people or condemning people in any way. But if you're asking me, what is wrong, so to speak, with Reform and Conservative Judaism, in a way, that's a pretty simple question. For example, we believe the Torah was given by God to Moshe. We believe the Torah is divine. And we also believe that along with the written Torah, there were supplementary oral interpretations that were passed down until they were written down. Now, the Reform movement does not believe in the divine origin of the Torah. That's very, very clear. Now, there may be individual Reform Jews who might. They're more towards tradition. But the official position of the movement is that the Torah is not a God-given document. It is a man-made document. So by definition, their again, I'm not saying they're bad, God forbid, they're not bad, but their theology is incorrect, and they're teaching things that we regard as falsehood. Now, when you relate to Reform Jews, whether it's your family or anybody, you don't have to use the vocabulary. This is wrong, this is heresy,
Right.
this is not because this. In fact, you don't have to use negative phrases at all. I wouldn't use negative phrases. I would just say, these are my beliefs. These are my beliefs, and this has kept the Jewish people alive for thousands of years, because remember, the Reform movement is only from the 1800s. The conservative movement is even later, right? So the notion of the term Orthodox Judaism is a newly created term, because until you had conservative and Reform, there was only Judaism, right? So what is called Orthodox Judaism was Judaism 250 years ago. So, as I say, if you want to make a case for Torah Judaism, you don't have to knock conservative Reform. Just talk about the belief systems that you have that have sustained the Jewish people, and hopefully they'll pick up on it and they'll see it in a positive way. And by the way, I would even praise one thing about Reform, and that is they brought to the fore maybe some aspects of mitzvos that sometimes in the mainstream religious camp were underemphasized a little bit, such as social justice and everything else. Although the definition of social justice is not always acceptable. They'll include transgender rights or whatever it is. So I'm not endorsing the definition, but a focus on homeless shelters, things like that, which is actually a good thing, so we can learn good things from people. So, but the point is, we don't need to denigrate. We don't need to put down people. But that does mean you don't compromise your belief system. Okay, so I hope that'll help you.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Right. So a bit touching the topic which has already been mentioned, but in a more like halachic aspect. So the women and their rights, so to speak. So there was recently a big news coming from Beit Shemesh, perhaps Rabbi heard of it?
Yeah.
Like from a mayor, and the mayor was attacked, etc., etc. So my question is obviously broader than this. It was just an example. I just started thinking, what halachically speaking, and in terms of our minhaks, perhaps, right, can be the role and the pose, the position of the woman, right, which could be both kosher but also high. And because, another example to entertain perhaps the people, and the interesting fact, perhaps Rav doesn't know, that oppositely in New York there was recently a big news that one of the first, there was a appointed one of the first Hasidic Orthodox women was appointed as a judge.
Yeah, Ruchi Freier,
oppositely.
Yeah.
Yes. So I started thinking, finalizing the question. So what halachically in Mechagalik woman can be in power? Can she be a Jewish kosher woman be in power, and what position can she take?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There actually is a halacha that a woman cannot be a king. Now that's the halacha. A woman cannot be a king, and then the poskim debate, what does that exactly mean? Is that only a king, whatever it is? So the bottom line halacha is that a woman should not have, in a halachic jurisdiction, a woman should not have authority. She should not have governmental, coercive authority over people. So a woman, we would think, shouldn't be a mayor, shouldn't be a judge. On the other hand, some poskim say that that only applies to non-democratic systems, meaning to say she shouldn't be imposed on people. But if people choose her, they're permitted. And the proof that they bring is from the case of Devorah. Remember Devorah. Devorah is a judge. She was a female, and she was a dayan. She was paskin. She sat under the palm tree outside to avoid yichud, so she didn't adjudicate cases inside the house. She only did it outside to avoid yichud, but she was a judge. So Tosfos asks the kasha, how could Devorah be a judge? A woman is not eligible to be a judge. Tosfos answers, since the litigants voluntarily submitted to her authority. So they could authorize a woman to be a judge. So some want to extend that, and this is a jump, this is not absolutely mukhrach, that this applies to any elected position, that essentially people have agreed to this person. So some say, well, no, that's not true, because in the case of Devorah, the actual people being judged submitted to her authority. Here, you have plenty of people who didn't vote for the judge. I mean, you're still imposing it on the people who didn't vote. So some say Devorah is not a good analogy to that. But that would be the issue. The issue would be positions of authority. This would include political office. This would include judges. This would include, even in shuls, president or treasurer of a synagogue. That's an interesting issue. Now, we do know, if you look at modern women today, even in the most Haredi circles, number one, women are teachers, that's obviously, but women are also principals. Women run schools.
Haredi.
Oh, thank you. Haredi I'm talking about, yeah. I'm not talking about modern. I'm talking about regular Haredi women. They run Beis Yaakovs. They run all sorts of schools. So it's an interesting question. If they take the position that women cannot have positions of authority over others, how does a woman become principal of a school? But apparently they take the position that for Torah education, that's not a political position, and they would allow it. And the other thing to keep in mind as well is that there is a controversy in left-wing orthodoxy about women rabbis. But this is very left-wing. This is beyond modern Orthodox. This is what's already called open Orthodox. Although they changed name. You got to know your names here. There used to be Modern Orthodox, and to the left of it was Open Orthodox. But Open Orthodox changed its name to Modern Orthodox, and Modern Orthodox had to change its name to Centrist Orthodox.
Wow.
So when you see the word Modern Orthodox, you got to know, are they using the old usage, meaning middle of the road, or are they using the new usage, which used to be Open Orthodox? So you got to check your definitions very, very carefully. So there is a debate. They even ordain women as rabbis. We consider that improper. But even those who would never allow women ordination, but we have women teachers, we have women lecturers, we have women very, very educated, learned women writing books. Rebbetzin Heller, Rabbi Gottlieb's, Rebbetzin Gottlieb, actually Rebbetzin Heller Gottlieb, has written many, many books, and there's a tremendous amount of teaching. So the point basically is that there may be some restrictions, but if a woman has creativity, a woman has knowledge, a woman has talent, Hashem's Torah does not straitjacket her. That's very important to understand this. Hashem gives people an outlet for their creativity and for their talents. You may have to find the right way to express it, but it's always going to be there, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not here to destroy your ability to make a contribution to the world. So you have to, when you think about women's role in Orthodoxy, you have to remember that. There are always going to be good avenues. Yeah, again, Rabbi Sandra, your own wife is Rebbe, and gives wonderful courses in parenting and the like. So there are going to be avenues, that's it. And you got to be a little creative to find those avenues. And it's true for men too. I mean, listen, there's a lot of stuff that you might think I become frum, I can't do anymore. I can't do a striptease dance in a nightclub. Okay. So what do I do? That's my one talent. Okay. The answer is you find some way. Maybe at a chasna you do beautiful dancing or whatever it is. There will always be an avenue. But you just have to spend time to figure it out.
So some poskim would agree, actually, women to be a mayor, in particular to women in Beit Shemesh, I mean in Israel, for instance, not America.
It's very difficult, halachically it's difficult to justify a woman being a mayor. The only heter would be that since it's an elected office, so someone who used the Tosfos in Gittin to say, like Devorah, they accepted it. But it is a questionable analogy because a lot of people didn't accept it. It's not like so that would be the fulcrum of the machlokas, whether the Devorah analogy would authorize elected political positions.
So actively, definitely no. Actively, no, I'm not.
No. So there is a halachic basis, but I think most would not accept it.
Would not. So in Israel, I would not hear a big posek saying, "Okay, mayor."
I don't think so,
Okay,
but I didn't do a
Thank
survey
you,
on it.
thank
Yeah. Oh, I want to point out another thing though. I'm sorry, I'll get to you. I want to give you a little historical analogy. You know, the Chashmonaim, the Maccabees, right? The Maccabees who won the victory against the Syrian Greeks, they established a monarchy called the Chashmonaim, the Hasmonean monarchy. And tragically, actually, even though the Maccabees were very, very righteous, but eventually their successors became Hellenists. Their successors became the very enemy they were fighting against. So most of the Hasmonean kings were not very righteous. But the one that was righteous was a woman. Towards the end, Shalom Tzion Hamalka. She has a street. If you go to Misrat HaPnim, which you spend hours at, it's on that street. And even though halachically she wasn't even supposed to have the job, but in her 10 years as queen, she honored the Chachamim. She rebuilt Torah. She did a tremendous amount. So, and the Chachamim had respect for her. Interesting question how that works. She wasn't supposed to have the office, but she was so much better than anyone else who would have had the office that they saw this as a justification to allow it. So that might be relevant on some of these cases too. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, why is there such a big discrepancy and difference, philosophically, between like mainstream Haredis and the religious Zionists, like the followers of Rav Kook?
Yeah. This is something that I think for an American, even if you're a yeshiva, educated American, and you come to Israel, it may be very shocking in a way. Because, I mean, listen, Dati Leumi is from, and Haredi is from. So what is this thing that we're so separated? We're so, different yeshivos and different thing. And, it's almost like, it's like you're intermarrying or whatever it would be. It is a very good question, and I'm not even going to totally justify it. I think there ought to be more achdus in this unit. But there are, ideological differences. Now, the problem is, Haredi is not monolithic, and Dati Leumi is not monolithic. In other words, you can't just say Haredi versus Dati Leumi. There are many varieties of Dati Leumi, and there are many varieties of Haredi as well. So, in a way, you almost have to look at, unit by unit by unit by unit. But basically, the closest comparison, and this is superficial, is between modern Orthodox and Yeshiva. You could almost look at Dati Leumi in most instances as a more modern version in which, again, I'm stereotyping, and there are many, many, many exceptions. But you might say Dati Leumi may be less committed to intensive learning of Torah, as opposed, going to university, encouraging more secular education. They have a much more proactive or pro-favorable view of the Medina, including not just celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is maybe a minor issue, but serving in the army is... Oh, the state of Israel. Serving in the army is considered to be a holy duty, as opposed to much of the Haredi who say that it's better not to. I'm not saying anything negative, but they say it's better not to if you don't have to. So the Haredi system has different people they look to as Gedolim than the Dati Leumi. They have different Gedolim in some ways.
Are they
So,
equal, would you say?
You know, it depends who you. It's hard. It's a hard question to ask. A Haredi would say the Gedolim are not equal, and Dati Leumi would also say the Gedolim are not equal on the other side.
Do they even have another Gedolim besides Rav Kook?
Yeah. Well, okay. Okay. Let me go back a little bit. Rav Kook has been gone for quite a few years. Rav Kook died in the 1930s. Now, I want to point out, Rav Kook was a gadol by all definitions. Rav Kook was a gadol in the eyes of what became Dati Leumi, and Rav Kook was a gadol in the eyes of Haredi Gedolim, although he had controversies and the like. So Rav Kook is a gadol among Gedolim. Put him in with, Rav Chaim Ozer, he's a gadol among Gedolim. It's not really. Now, as Dati Leumi diverged from Haredi, what then happened was that there were different types of Gedolim who became associated with the movement. So they do have people that they regard as Gedolim. Haredi world does not regard them. I don't want to get into names, but they do have people that they regard as authoritative poskim for their particular shita. Now, I want to point out, therefore, that in Dati Leumi there is something called chardal. Now, chardal, which means mustard, it's interesting, but it's an abbreviation. Haredi Dati Leumi. You have Dati Leumi who believe in the army, and they believe in Zionism, but in every other respect they want to be like Haredi in terms of learning, in terms of all of these things. So in Dati Leumi there's a more modern group, and then there's chardal. Within Dati Leumi there are messianic people who really believe that the state of Israel is the precursor to Moshiach. And then you have people who say, no, we're Zionists, but we don't believe it's Moshiach yet. So there's a big diversity of it. But by and large, we would say that it's a more modern orientation. It's more connected to secularism, favor the army, favor university. Right? So these are differences. Now, in America, these differences exist too, between a Lakewood person and a YU person, let's say. But they seem to be not as strong, not as definitive as they are in Israel. Israel is a country of bright colors. We don't have pastels. Like everything is bright. Haredi is definitely something, and Dati Leumi is definitely something, and therefore they don't mix so much. In America, we mix and match a little more. So one of the difficulties of Aliyah, it's a real difficulty, is you're used to more of a working together, and here you don't find it. And there could be reasons for that, but in a way, it's also a problem to work on. So take a Chashuv Gadol like Rav Asher Weiss. You've heard of Rav Asher Weiss. He's American-born, but he's a Hasidic person, but he's one of the big poskim of the generation. Very, very Chashuv person, very well accepted in Haredi circles. He's Haredi circles. But he gives shiurim, and he's almost the only one. He gives shiurim, not only in black hat Haredi yeshivas, but he gives a shiur in Yeitzer HaRah, which is the main Dati Leumi yeshiva, and he tries to go everywhere that people are religious and listen to Torah. So that's a really, really good role model, and I actually I wish there would be more people building bridges. And it's interesting that in the past there were attempts to do this, and they worked for a while, and then they got discontinued. Rav Baruch Mordechai Ezrachi, he should be well, who's a Chashuv Haredi Rosh Yeshiva, had for a number of years, before he had his own yeshiva, I guess he got too involved in that, had a summer camp for Dati Leumi high school students to learn with like Avrechem from Haredi Kololim, Meir, Chevron, Panovich, and the like. And that way, even though they remained Dati Leumi, but they would be inspired just by learning. It wasn't intended to be ideological. They would have discussions about philosophy and about hashkafa, but it was not designed to change them. It was not designed to convert them. It was simply saying, hey, we're both religious Jews. Let's grow in our Torah learning, in our avodas Hashem. That's a wonderful thing. Ad kedei kach that Rav Shach told Rav Rach he wanted to stop it because he was doing other things. Rav Shach said, you're not allowed to stop the camp. You stop the other things you're doing. You got to keep the camp. You got to keep this camp going. It did get discontinued. I don't know the whole history of it, but we need, I mean, on the estate, I feel we need more things like that. There shouldn't be such a gap as has developed, and it's gotten kind of more deep in recent years.
Rabbi, Meir Kahane, he said that a Jew should be like King David, where he should be both a scholar and a warrior.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you kind of think about that?
So Meir Kahane is what was Hashem Yinkum Damo, he was assassinated, was a very, very interesting person. First of all, I want to say, to his credit, he was a person who loved the Jewish people. He really felt Jewish suffering when Jews were hurt, when Jews were harmed. It really, really bothered him, and he worked very, very hard to do the best that he could for the Jewish people. But as a result, he developed a certain militaristic strategy. It started in New York with the Jewish Defense League. Basically, if Jews were being victimized, he would just send a bunch of his guys to beat them up and use violence and teach them a lesson. Okay, so he was already an advocate of stopping violence by violence. That was his thing. Okay. He then came to Yeitzer HaRah, and he actually was elected to the Knesset, and he was teaching the same thing. He said, let's offer the Arabs money to get out of town, and if they don't accept our offer, we'll kick them out of town, things like that. And by the way, I'm seeing now, people wear T-shirts. You have to know your history. It says, Kahana Tzodek, Kahana was right. They're wearing it in the light rail and the like. Not everybody knows what that's referring to, but that's what it's referring to. And you have this guy Ben Gvir, who kind of is Kahana light. He's not as extreme, but he's very much in that direction. So Meir Kahane eventually got expelled from the Knesset, I believe. I believe he was expelled, and right. Then they got killed, which again is a tragic thing. His motives were very, very pure. I am absolutely not questioning his motives, but unfortunately, Chazal have a saying that sometimes your love can distort your judgment, and at some point, Gedolim were telling people not to use violence. Gedolim were saying we have to. We're still in Golos, even in Eretz Yisrael. We have to learn to accommodate. We have to leave things to the police. We don't take the law into our own hands. And Meir Kahane took the position that, hey, saving Jews is so important that I will do what I have to do. Now, unfortunately, this is the tragedy of a very well-meaning person who does not accept Das Torah, does not accept the Gedolei Hador, the great Gedolim of the Dor. And unfortunately, the projects come to a failure when that happens. It's not the first time in our history where well-meaning people simply ignored the hadracha, the guidance of Gedolei Hador. So I don't want to say bad things about Meir Kahane because I will say again and again that I believe he had very pure motives. And in some ways, I wish I had the Avas Yisrael that he had, no question. And by the way, he was also a learned person too. But as I say, he substituted his judgment for that of the Gedolim, and that came to a bad end. Yeah.
So in the same subject with the Meir Kahane and Jewish radicalism, and I would say this kind of more corrupting that himself would be guilty of is how to deal with. There's this, I would say, despisement or antagonizing of Arabs, and of course it can corrupt it corrupt myself, and it's how do I deal with this kind of these things, because now you have also from the Arab world you have so much coming against us, and I try to be the best I can, but it's so hard because you have
it's very hard. There's a saying in politics that the definition of a conservative is a liberal who was mugged. Meaning, we all start off, we got to be kind, we got to be good, we got to be generous, we have to recognize the rights of everybody, etc. But then we see that when we try to be nice, we try to be generous, we try to be accommodating, that is not seen as kindness, that is seen as weakness. Middle East is not the United States, and weakness is exploited. In other words, unfortunately, we have an enemy that does not return kindness for kindness, but rather the old saying, give a finger, take a hand. you know? So in a sense, you know, when people ask me, you know, hey, what type of racists or bigots are Israelis? You know, they say bad things about the Arabs. And I say, you know, when you lost your child because a bus blew up, it's a little hard to be so kind and compassionate to the other side. So in some ways, you know, I don't blame people for these hardline attitudes. But at the same time, the Gedolim, I think, have told us that ultimately, you know, everybody is in the image of God. We try to treat people with respect. We try not to condemn a whole people because of what some people do. And hopefully, you know, that was the first question. I mean, until Moshiach, we're going to have these things. We're going to have these things happening, but at least we try to show derech eretz to everybody. So it's a difficult challenge because again, it's very, very hard when you yourself have suffered. And of course, Israel is a small country, so almost everybody knows somebody who suffered a very significant, tragic loss. But you still try not to be a hateful person. You know, there's a medrash in Tanid Ve'Eliyahu. It's a very interesting medrash. The medrash says, he who hates the guy will come to hate the Jew. He who steals from the guy will come to steal from the Jew. He who murders the guy will come to murder the Jew. Meaning morality is not divisible that much. You know, you get into the habit of lying, cheating, stealing, because they're goyim or whatever it is, without even getting into the technicalities of the halacha. That's a whole other discussion, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. But that affects your personality. It affects your mitzvos. It affects your character. And once you've affected your character, it's going to carry over to those other relationships as well, right? You can't just be dishonest with goyim and then honest, you know, with Jews. It doesn't work that way. Once you habituate yourself to cheat, you become a cheater, and that's going to be in every part of your life. Yeah.
I was going to ask, when you become like closer with the faith and you do more torah, mitzvot, kedusha, do you feel like sometimes your Yeitzer HaRah can grow with you? And also,
yeah.
Sometimes you'll like pass a challenge, and for years you'll have that challenge go in the bag, and then sometimes you'll just kind of come back a little bit. That's these old challenges. Why do you think that is? And what do you think the nature of the Yeitzer HaRah?
Yep, that's a very, really excellent question. You know, all of you have heard of the book Tanya, the Chabad Bible, so to speak. The Tanya was written by the first Rabbi Dr. who was a great gadol, acknowledged as such by everybody. Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And Tanya is only the first word of the book. Tanya is not the title of the title of the book actually is, well, Likutei Amarim, which means an anthology of statements, but the other title is The Book of the Benoni. The book of the middle of the roaders, right? We have righteous people, we have evil people, and then we have middle of the roaders, the mediocrities. Tanya is the book for middle of the roaders. Now, how is that so? So this is the Alter Rebbe's thesis. The Alter Rebbe writes in the introduction to Tanya that people were coming to him with problems that they had. And after a while, so many people were coming to him, he figured he had to write a book because he couldn't meet with everybody anymore. And the problems they had were not, how do I know there's God? How do I know the Torah comes? They believed in that. They believed in God. They believed in Torah. They were doing mitzvahs. What was their problem? Their problem was your question exactly. It's amazing that you asked that question. That I serve Hashem for so many years, and I still have these same problems that I'm struggling with, the same Yeitzer HaRahs. Why haven't I made progress? And people were getting despondent, and people were getting sad, and people were saying, I'm a failure. I'm a loser. So the thesis of the Tanya is a revolutionary thesis, actually. He says, the goal is not to get over your problems. You were put in the world to be a soldier, to fight this battle. And that is what a middle of the roader is. Middle of the roader is, I'm a member of the infantry, and I got to fight my battle. And I'm not relieved from duty until I'm called home, i.e., I die. So Rav Shneur Zalman said, you have to know that if you're still struggling, that's not a failure. You're just doing your job. That's the job that God gave you on earth. And fighting that battle is giving an enormous pleasure to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? So that's actually, in other words, we don't necessarily move to another area where we don't have struggle. Rather, our life is struggle. And we should find the joy in that struggle. That's actually, the Tanya in one sentence, I think, is the essential thesis of Sefer Shel Beinonim. Yeah.
For a lot of the people, especially like Mechina, a lot of them are Baal Teshuvas, and when it comes to like Judaism, as you said, there's many different paths to go on. And like for example, yesterday I was having a conversation with somebody about Hashem and Judaism and all that, and they asked me if I'm Haredi or from what. I'm like, I'm just Jewish. I don't know. I'm just.
That's a perfectly good answer.
But as I continue to grow and go down. How do you kind of like, pick which way to go, whether it's Haredi or Hasidic or.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard decision. I mean, I tell people, there is no mitzvah in the Torah that says thou shalt be Haredi. It's not one of the 613 mitzvahs. So, you have to do mitzvos, you have to learn Torah, you have to serve Hashem. So then you're looking for a community and a society and friends which gives you the most opportunities to learn Torah, to do mitzvos, and serve Hashem. Haredi may be the particular, of course, Haredi again has many, many variations and colors, but Haredi may be it, Dati Leumi may be it, but you're essentially asking the question, not am I Haredi or Dati Leumi, but what is the environment which is best for my growth in Torah, mitzvos, and avodas Hashem. Okay, that's focus. Always focus on the central question and not on the peripheral question. Now, how do you choose? How do you choose? So the answer is, listen, people sometimes tell me, well, how can I choose Judaism? I haven't explored every other religion. Well, what are you supposed to do? There are at least 400 religions. You got to start somewhere or you'll do nothing at all. The person that says, I'm not going to make a decision till I look at everything, will do nothing. That's for sure. So you got to start somewhere. So the most logical place is, you're in a yeshiva, you have rebbeim, you have classes, you're learning about Judaism. So naturally, I think one would try to see if the environment they're in is the one that's giving them the right guidance and try to connect to that environment. Now, B'ezras Hashem, many, many, many Talmidim have found, let's say, or Somayach's derech, or whatever the hashkafa is, to be the right derech for them. And I hope you'll find it as well. And of course, within our Somayach, there are different rebbeim too, so it's not a monolithic thing here either. But if not, then you check. Meaning, it's like a search like any other search. Meaning, you may have to sometimes go to several places to check it out. But you always have to have in mind the central question: what brings me closer to Hashem? And then I gauge everything based on that. Yeah.
So I've heard the concept from many places where, learning Torah, people make a mistake that, it's not just an academic pursuit. It's not a matter of just trying to clock the hours or get the knowledge into your head. I heard a quote in a shmooze from one of the Rebbeim in the Mirror quite recently. I think he was actually quoting from Ali Shore, maybe possibly. He said it right. Being a Talmid Chacham doesn't mean knowing a lot academically. It means you're like a walking Sefer Torah. The Torah you've learned is in you, right? You're learning, and it's an avodah. It's a deeper, meaningful thing you're connecting to. We've often heard the idea that in learning Torah, you should be connecting to Hashem in learning Torah. It should be like almost like a deeper emotional experience. It's not an academic pursuit. I've heard that the Nefesh Chaim expounds in depth on what exactly the avodah is. What exactly are we doing when we're learning Torah? What's the goal? What's the idea of it? Could the Rav expound on that?
Yeah, so it's interesting that the Nefesh Chaim has an interesting take on this. Nefesh Chaim does talk about how learning Torah connects you to God, but he says it's like a subconscious process. You shouldn't be thinking about it too much, meaning the problem is, you see, if when you learn, you're thinking, this is how I connect to God, you will often not have the patience for the technical details of Torah. You're learning a Gemara, and there's some machlokas, Rashi and Tosfos, about an ox that gores a cow. Now you're going to ask, what's the spiritual message here? I don't see the spiritual message. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner says, you have to take it on faith that it's the immersion in the Torah itself that connects you to God. You don't consciously be thinking about God, 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 God. So he suggests that every few hours you take 5 minutes and you think about Hashem. But then you focus on the material, right? That's a very, very fascinating point. As opposed to Hasidus, which did stress a more self-conscious awareness of Dveikus. So both Rav Chaim Volozhin and the Hasidim say that Limud HaTorah is perhaps the most deepest way that we connect to Hashem. But in Hasidus, it became a much more self-conscious exercise. Among the Litvasha, based on the Nefesh HaChaim, it is a subconscious automatic thing that happens by total immersion in the material. I mentioned before that the Chazon Ish writes, and I've never been zeicher to do this, so I don't know, the joy and ecstasy a person experiences when they learn 10 hours straight or 12 hours straight. And he describes it as exponentially higher and higher and higher and higher and higher in ways that are quite frankly amazing. I mean, maybe once in our life we should try to 10 hours without interruption and see where it takes us if we could ever do such a thing. So the point of the Rebbe in Mir is a very good point. Torah is not only about information. Torah is creating a relationship with Hashem. And it should change us. It should redefine us. That is why when you learn Torah, you should be a better husband and a better father and a kinder person and a more giving person. It shouldn't bring out, gaiva and arrogance and all of those other things. If it does, that shows that you haven't learned Torah the right way, because you've taken in the information maybe, but it hasn't changed you. What do they say? It's a famous statement of Rabbi Dr. Somebody was talking about a certain guy as a chassan for someone. So they said, he's been through Shas 5 times. So Rabbi Dr. said, how many times has Shas been through him? He's been through Shas. Has the Shas changed him? In any ways, right? You have to have it that way too. So you're right. We have to have the Torah work on us. Okay. All right. Anyway, thank you very much. It was really great talking to you, and I want to wish you all again. We still have more than a week till the end of the year. So Be'ezus Hashem, Chazal teach us everything follows the end, right? So if you end the year in a good way, that's a tremendous suchus for the new year that is coming up. So you should all have a ksiva chesima tova, a good rest of Elul Zman, and Be'ezus Hashem, we should be zocher to a shana tova mesukah.